You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get started, wanted to have a quick chat with you guys because I've been talking to a lot of you guys on social media. Don't forget to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast or at Hazard Ground. You guys have been doing such a great job with listener suggestions. Keep them coming. We love to hear from you guys on stories that you want to hear told. It certainly lets us know that you like what we're doing, but you guys are a great source for us to get new guests and ideas that we haven't thought of. So keep them coming. We certainly appreciate that. Don't forget about our partnership with Amazon. All you got to do is go to our website, hazardground.com, click on the sponsors tab or scroll down to the bottom of the homepage, click on that Amazon banner, and you do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage. Like we tell you every week, we take that percentage and we donate it back to some of the great charities you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Leave us a rating and a review on iTunes. Continue to help grow this show. Continue to help grow the Hazard Ground community. You guys are what make this podcast so special. And because we get such great feedback from you guys, we're able to keep doing what we do. With that said, we have another amazing episode for you coming up right now. Joining us this week is an extremely unique and very special guest. Simply put, he is a journalist, but he has become so much more than that. He has covered every major engagement since Vietnam, to include Vietnam, the Gulf War, and both the wars on terror. He was sworn into service as a special consultant to the Vietnam War 50th Anniversary Commemoration Project run by the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was part of the Vietnam documentary made by Ken Burns. His story not only is a book, but also a movie, one that you may have seen, We Were Soldiers, starring Mel Gibson and Barry Pepper. And finally, he was awarded the Bronze Star Medal with V for rescuing wounded soldiers under fire in Ia Drang Valley in November 1965, the only Medal of Valor that the U.S. Army has awarded to a civilian for his actions in combat during the Vietnam War. He is Joe Galloway joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Joe, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be with you.
A very distinguished career from a writing standpoint. And it's a little bit different because we always ask people how they got into the military when we start the podcast. But, you know, the idea that you were awarded the Bronze Star with Valor, the only award from the Army to be awarded with Valor to a civilian, is certainly incredible. And I want to hear all about the experience in Vietnam. But I guess I'm curious as to how you got into reporting.
I think I was born to it. Started a neighborhood newspaper when I was 10 years old and worked on the high school newspaper, founded a weekly newspaper in my hometown. The summer I graduated high school, it's still publishing today, 50-some years later. And, I went to college for 6 weeks. It bored me stiff, and I was on my way to the Army recruiter with my mother to sign the papers. I was only 17 at the time, and thank God she said, as we passed the daily newspaper, she said, "But what about your journalism?" I said, "Good call, Mom, stop the car." And I walked into the Victoria, Texas Advocate and got myself hired as a $35 a week reporter, and haven't looked back.
All right, so you decided you were going to be a reporter. What time frame was this? I know you said you were ready to enlist in the Army. What time frame was all this happening?
1959.
Okay, so World War II had just ended. Korea had actually ended as well. Did you get a sense that like Vietnam was on the horizon at this point? Did you really think that, you know, the military was something that would have given you a better life, or you were worried about what?
I had no idea about Vietnam, nor did anybody in America at that time. It would be about 1963 when I started reading the dispatches of Dave Halberstam and Malcolm Brown and Neil Sheehan out of a place called Saigon, that I began to feel that there was going to be a war in this place. It would become America's war, and I wanted to cover it. as a kid, I read the collected works of a guy named Ernie Pyle, a famous World War II correspondent. And I thought, if my generation has a war, I want to cover it, and I'd like to cover it like Ernie Pyle covered his war.
So you begin your journalism career. Did you know at that point in time that you wanted to do military correspondence and only focus on that, or were you doing other things first and you stumbled upon it?
I was doing everything. I worked for UPI. I was a one-man bureau chief in Topeka, Kansas, covering the state government, the courts, the military. There are a couple of big bases close by, Fort Leavenworth, Fort Riley. I was doing everything, and I would continue to do that for 20 years with UPI and another 20 with U.S. News and World Report magazine. None of us really could focus on one small thing like covering the military, so I covered everything.
Okay, so your journalism career is up and running, and Vietnam begins to kick off. Obviously we're in the early 60s here at this point. Do you know that you want to go over there and cover the war on the front lines, or were you just covering it from a distance?
Absolutely. Okay. I was sending a letter a week to my bosses in New York City, begging and pleading to be sent to Southeast Asia to cover what I thought was going to become an American war. And right after the 1964 presidential election, I was home on leave in South Texas at my mother's house, and I got a phone call from my boss who said, do you own a trench coat? And I said no, and I was quite puzzled. He said, well, you better buy one. You're about to become a foreign correspondent. You're being transferred to the UPI Asia headquarters in Tokyo, Japan.
Wow.
And, to be transferred from Topeka, Kansas to Tokyo is an impossibility. But somehow it happened for me, and I headed for Tokyo, and I got there, and I told the boss, I want to go to Saigon. And he said, this is December of 64. He said, look, I just sent a second American to Saigon, and I'm sure we'll never need any more than that. And I thought, well, we'll see. And in March of 65, the 1st Battalion of Marines landed in Da Nang, and in early April of 65, I landed in Da Nang to cover those Marines.
Wow. So apparently all your letters worked, obviously.
Something did.
It's weird. It's hard to ignore when people write your letters repeatedly. I've learned that throughout the course of my life. If you keep sending an actual letter to somebody, a handwritten letter, you'll get their attention a lot quicker. So take that for what you will.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so it's April 1965. You get to Vietnam. How quickly are you embedded in a unit, and what are you starting to see right off the bat?
I tell you, it was very, I was in a lather to get there. I was afraid, the war was going to be over. The Marines are landing. It's going to be John Wayne on Iwo Jima. I've got to get down there, and I got there, and one of the first operations I went on was in a place called Quang Ngai Province, south of Da Nang, and the place was surrounded by Viet Cong forces, and it looked like being overrun, and photographer for UPI grabbed me and hauled me onto a C-130. I didn't know where we were going. We flew down there. He got off, and the airport was a jumble. Everything was going on. He ran over to an old Marine H-34 shuttering shithouse helicopter and said something to the crew chief and waved to me, and we got on this chopper, and bang, we're flying out over the rice paddies. And, I haven't even had time to buy myself a set of fatigues. I'm wearing chinos and loafers, for God's sakes. And we fly out about 15 minutes, and we're circling a bare hill. It sticks stuck up out of the rice paddies, and I can see people on this hill lying down, and we land, and the chopper shuts down. We get off, and it's dead quiet because the people on this hill are all dead. It's a South Vietnamese battalion that had been overrun. And why the crew chief let us on this chopper was he needed help to find the bodies of the 2 American advisors who were with this battalion when it was overrun.
Wow.
And they had just had time to, not even dig a foxhole, just a dip in the earth where they could lay down and have some shelter. And they all were like, their arms were out like they were holding rifles, but the rifles were all gone and the men were all dead. And we went man to man until we found the 2 Americans and carried their bodies back to the helicopter. And that
Joe,
was my real introduction to combat in Vietnam. And it sure didn't look like John Wayne.
No, I was going to ask you, how long had you been in country when this had happened?
A few days.
Wow. Oh, I mean, really? So you're here a few days. I'm just. What were you told heading in? What were you supposed to cover? Did you have a specific assignment? What did they want you to do, or just send back information on what you see?
Cover whatever's happening.
And so,
that night after this horrifying experience on this hill, the photographer, a wonderful man named Henri Huet, half French, half Vietnamese, later was killed in a helicopter crash in 1971.
Oh my God!
He said, all the Americans go back to Da Nang at night because it's so unsafe here. But if we stay, we'll be here first thing in the morning, and we'll get a jump on our competition, the Associated Press. And what do I know? I say, sure. And as it's getting dark, all the Americans leave except for the MACV advisors. And we go to their compound, and this tall American captain with red-rimmed eyes says, "I'm sure glad to see you guys. We've been on 100% alert here for the last 7 days and nights. And so you can stand a tour at guard tonight." And that's what we did. I was on the 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. and the captain gave us M2 grease gun, 45 caliber submachine gun, and a couple of magazines. And my turn came as the longest night of my life. I'm in a bunker holding this submachine gun and looking out through the barbed wire. The Viet Cong threw satchel charges in the Arvin compound across a dirt alley in the middle of the night. And just as the first bit of sun is starting to peak above the horizon and a little light on the subject, I see a Vietnamese on a bicycle with a big package on the front of it coming down that road toward the compound. And I'm ready to shoot him. And about that time, the captain slaps me on the shoulder and says, "Don't you shoot that man, son. He's the cook. And if you kill him, you're going to have to make breakfast." So that's my introduction to Vietnam.
Joe, that is unreal. So in the course of a couple of days, you see terror, beyond horror, beyond, just whatever. It was a mass grave on that hill that you saw. And next thing you know, you're standing behind a machine gun. At any point in time, did you think to yourself, this is not what I signed up for?
Several times, but I had signed up for it, and I was there. And what I figured out was you got to learn this game, and you got to learn it quick, or you're going to get yourself killed. And from that point forward, I was on every Marine operation in I Corps, to include a combat amphibious assault landing where we cleared the peninsula so they could build the Chulai airstrip. And, the Marines, God love them, they didn't have many helicopters, so they walked to work. The local VC were running circles around them because they knew the turf and the Marines didn't. So there were a lot of long, hot walks in the sun with the Marines.
Did you ever stop and think to yourself, I probably should have just joined the Army? I'm getting, doing the exact same thing that they're doing.
Well, I thought about it occasionally, but, the thing about being a correspondent is you could always leave. If you're wearing the green suit, you got to stick with it.
So did that thought ever creep into your mind? Hey, maybe it's time for me to go?
No.
Why?
No, I couldn't leave. I did 4 tours in Vietnam. At the end of my first 16 months there, I thought, I need to get out of here or I'm going to get killed.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever want to come back. But my bosses kept calling my cards in and sending me back. Sent me back in 1971 for the invasion of Laos, and 73 for the POW release and the phony peace. And then in 75, I was there watching it all go down the toilet.
Okay.
And I couldn't, it was difficult.
Yeah,
After that first 16 months, we had all learned together, and then all of the troops got up. The ones I'd marched with all got up and went home, and I was left there with a whole bunch of newcomers. And it's the newcomers who get you killed.
Yeah, because they don't know, right? Everything is new to them.
And it's going to take them 3 or 4 months to learn, and that's the period in which 60% of your KIAs are taken among the newbies.
Yeah, Joe, you just something just popped into my head as you were talking. How do you merge your journalistic sense with your survivalist sense? And what I mean by that is, at some point in time, are you sitting here thinking, in general, what the hell are we doing here as a country? This is unwinnable. We keep getting guys killed. I mean, does any of that come into your head? And do you start to think about the, quote, cause that they're fighting for?
Absolutely.
And what was your reaction to? What were you thinking?
It comes into your head very quickly. The simple truth is that I could see very clearly that there's no way we're going to commit the number of troops that it will take to defeat this enemy. And therefore, we cannot win. But I can't say that.
Why?
First of all, I worked for UPI, and I was taught from the first day it's okay to have an opinion, but it never goes in your copy. You don't write your opinion. You report the facts and let people make up their own minds. And so that's one reason. The other reason was that I had marched with and fought alongside these young Americans, and I couldn't stand there and tell them that they and their friends were dying in a lost cause. I couldn't do that.
But didn't you think they might have known that already? Don't you think they felt that sense?
Most of them didn't.
Okay. I'm just
and it would, to me, it would have been a betrayal.
You know, you seem to take a
stand
very
there and tell them that they were dying for no good reason.
Joe, you seem to have, at least what you're saying, in a very short time, developed such a kinship with these guys and such a brotherhood that you felt like you were one of them, that telling them that, because a lot of journalists had no problem saying that out loud. A lot of journalists are telling the world, you know, this is an unwinnable war. We don't belong here. I mean, that was a media narrative back then, and the fact
not early on.
Okay.
Took a while for that, just like it took a while for the American people to realize, as they watched this flood tide of shiny silver coffins coming back from Vietnam to every little town in America. It was 1968 before the tide turned back home. And it was probably then that the tide turned among the reporters, too.
All right, let's fast forward here to November 1965. You've been in country now, what, about 7 months?
Something like that.
And we get to the Battle of Ia Drang Valley. So what do you know going in to this particular engagement?
Not a lot. What I knew is there were some tigers loose in the jungle. And I knew this because in mid-October of 65, I managed to persuade an old Texas Huey pilot to fly me into a place called Play Me Special Forces Camp, which was surrounded by and besieged by a North Vietnamese Army regiment of regular troops and about a dozen of those 51 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns. And I jumped off that helicopter, and my buddy pulled pitch and flew out, and Master Sergeant ran up to me and said, "Sir, I don't know who you are, but Major Beckwith wants to see you right away." And I said, "Well, which one is he?" And he said, "It's that big guy over there jumping up and down on his hat." And I went over and Sergeant Charlie Beckwith, who later would found Delta, said, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "I'm a reporter." He said, "Jesus H. Christ," he said, "I need everything in the world. I need ammo. I need medevacs. I need food. I'd love to have a bottle of Jim Beam and a box of cigars. And what has the Army in its wisdom sent me but a goddamn reporter?"
I don't mean to laugh,
said,
Joe, but
he said, "I have news for you, son. I have no vacancy on my staff for a reporter, but I'm in desperate need of a corner machine gunner, and you're it."
And you said what?
And then he gave me about 10 minutes of get-rich-quick instruction on the care and feeding of the 30 caliber air-cooled light machine gun, and put me in a bunker with instructions that were very concise. He said, "Shoot the little brown men outside the wire. The ones inside belong to me." And so for 3 days and nights, I guess, I was on that machine gun. And finally, an armor column broke through the ambush, and a battalion of the newly arrived 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile came in by helicopter, and I was going to go out the gate and hook up with the 1st Cav guys and sweep around the camp and see what had been done there. And Beckwith waved me over, and he said he thanked me for my service, and he said, "You're not carrying a piece." And I said, "Well, technically speaking, in spite of the use you have made of me these last 3 days, I'm a civilian non-combatant." And Beckwith looked at me and he shook his head. He said, "Son, there ain't no such thing in these mountains. And he had the sergeant major go off and fetch me an M16 and a bag of magazines, and I went out the gate with that rifle on my shoulder, and that was fortuitous. 3 weeks later, I'm in the Kateca tea plantation, where the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry has a forward headquarters, and they're starting to operate. And I did one little operation with the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, under a guy named Hal Moore as the battalion commander. And it was truly a long, hot walk in the sun up in the mountains. And but we got to know each other, and 3 days later, Moore starts lifting his battalion into a clearing called Landing Zone X-Ray in the Ia Drang Valley. And I'm trying my best to get there. The brigade commander, Colonel Brown, said, "Don't worry, if anything happens, I'll be going out there and you can ride with me." And sure enough, something did happen, something big. And by the time we flew out over that area, the smoke was rising 5,000 feet in the air, and all hell was breaking loose on the ground. Moore and what portion of his battalion had been landed were fighting for their lives. And we're circling overhead. The enemy shoots down an A-1E Sky Raider right below our helicopter. I watch it go in. And Moore is waving his boss off. He told him, "If you land that command chopper with all those antennae here, you're going to have to walk home because the enemy will shoot it to pieces." So Brown dumps me at the artillery fire base about 5 clicks away, and I spend the rest of that day, 14 November, a Sunday, trying to get across those 5 clicks to the battle. And as the day wears on, about 5 other reporters turn up. Now I've not only got to get myself to the battle, I got to make sure they don't get there. And
now, why did you want to make sure they didn't get there? Just so you had the story first?
Yeah, and exclusively. So as the day wears on, I spot a familiar face. It's Captain Greg Dillon, Hal Moore's operations officer. And I grab him. I said, Matt, I got to get in there. And he said, "Well, I'm going in as soon as it's dark with 2 helicopters full of ammo, but I can't take you unless the old man says so." I said, "Let's get him on the radio." And he gets on the Prick 25, and I'm right there listening to the conversation. He tells Moore when he's coming and what he's bringing. And, oh, by the way, that reporter Galloway, who was with us the other day, he wants to come too. And Moore, God rest his soul, his response was, "If he's crazy enough to want to come in here, and you got room, bring him." So I had my ride nailed down, and all I had to do then was hide out. And as it got near dark, those 5 other reporters all got on helicopters going back to Pleiku to get a hot dinner and a cool cot for the night. And I got a helicopter ride into the pages of history.
Joe, there's a strange dichotomy how you felt such a kinship to the soldiers, right? And such a tight bond with them to protect them and work with them and not say anything bad about the mission. Yet the fellow reporters almost were your combatants in this whole thing. It's like, I don't want them anywhere near this. There's a strange juxtaposition there.
There's nothing like the competition between the UPI and the AP in those days, and I knew that if the AP got in there an hour ahead of me, I was screwed, and they knew the reverse was true as well.
Amazing stuff. Okay, so you get your ride, you land there at night. All right,
That's
so you're
right.
coming into 15 November. Give me the kind of how things are starting to formulate until dawn comes up.
Well, we bail off. We pull all of the boxes of ammo that we've been sitting on into the tall grass and fall flat, and the two choppers take off. And there's a voice out of the darkness who says, follow me and I'll take you to the old man, and watch where you step. There's a lot of bodies around here, and they're all American.
Oh, God.
And that was the voice of Command Sergeant Major Basil L. Plumley, a bear of a man out of West Virginia who was Hal Moore's Command Sergeant Major. And he led us over to an anthill, we called them, a termite mound about the size of a Volkswagen car. And Colonel Moore was there, and he welcomed me and told me that he couldn't guarantee my safety, and that was an understatement. And I told him I saw a lot of lights coming down the mountain headed your way, and I assumed they're enemy. And he ordered up some artillery to welcome them. And I found a little tree and sat down with my back against it and my cameras and my rifle across my legs, and waited for the sun to come up.
Okay.
Long night.
Mm-hmm. Did you sleep at all?
Huh?
Did you sleep at all?
Not that night. The enemy were probing the perimeter, trying to figure out where we were, and there was a good bit of artillery coming in, and things would get a whole lot worse as soon as the sun came up.
In that, what happens next as the sun comes up?
Well, Hal Moore has a platoon, or what's left of it, trapped outside the perimeter, and he's figuring out an operation to go get them when all hell breaks loose, as they say in the movies. 2 battalions of the enemy attack Charlie Company on our southeast side, and everything that they fire which doesn't hit something passes right through where we're all sitting, or now laying down, in the command post, which is behind Charlie Company. And I'm laying there just getting as flat to the ground as I can, because all this stuff is coming over at about 30 inches off the ground. And I feel a thump in my ribs, and I turn my head very carefully to see what the hell is this. Have I been hit already? And what it is a size 12 combat boot on the foot of Sergeant Major Plumley. And he bends over and hollers at me over the din of this battle, which is deafening. And what he hollers is this: "You can't take no pictures laying there on the ground, Sonny." And I thought, well, he's right. Later, I would learn sergeants major are always right. And like a fool, I got up. And, whatever fear that I had to that point went away, because I followed the sergeant major to see what the hell he was going to do next. He was gathering up a sort of a reserve force of me and the cooks and bakers, or what else is floating around, including the battalion surgeon and the medical platoon sergeant He goes over to them. He yanks out his .45, jacks around in, and says, "Gentlemen, prepare to defend yourselves." And the doctor looks like he's been shot. He's stunned. Whatever he got drafted to do, it certainly wasn't to use that .45 on his hip. And Plumlee was gathering up a reserve because this old man who had seen an awful lot of war thought we were likely to be overrun at any time, and he wanted some protection for the command post. And it just went downhill from there.
What do you mean downhill? How so?
Well, the attacks were fierce. The casualties were mounting. We had a line of dead Americans wrapped in their own ponchos that stretched seemingly forever. Charlie Company had almost ceased to exist. I started out with 120 men at the beginning of the day, and by now they had fewer than 40 who were still on their feet and fighting. The rest of them were dead or wounded, including the company commander. It was tough. It was tough. It was hard. There were people fighting and dying all around me. And I have to tell you a story. Right in the middle of all of that, I eased out to a little bush on the edge of the clearing, and I was kneeling down there shooting some pictures. And out of the corner of my eye, see a guy jump up out of a mortar pit and start zigzagging across the clearing, coming toward me, and there are bullets kicking up dirt behind him, and he dives under that bush. And he says, "Joe Galloway, don't you know me, man? It's Vince Cantu from Refugio, Texas." I had gone to high school with this kid and graduated in a class of 55 of us in 1959, and here I am in the worst battle of the Vietnam War, and here's old Vince. He come over to warn me that I shouldn't be walking around taking pictures like a goddamn tourist. They're killing people all around us. We both made it. Vince made it home. He had finished up his 2-year draft tour that week and eventually got a ride home and went to see my mom and dad. I told him, "Don't you dare tell them where we met."
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, everything is so chaotic at this point. I can't even imagine that you had a moment to think or to try to figure out where you were, what was going on. Like, how are you processing all this, I guess, is the question.
Well, I thought the chances are pretty good that we might be overrun and all of us killed. And I started hiding my rolls of film in my pockets and in my boots and trying to take more complete notes in my notebook just in case that if I'm killed, they'll at least find this story and these pictures, that there'll be some way I fulfill my destiny. So you think about those things. You also think about the fact that you're surrounded in a river valley by an overwhelmingly superior enemy force, and you're with the 7th U.S. Cavalry, George Armstrong Custer's old outfit. That'll give you pause.
Yeah. Okay, so give me what happens next. And I have my notes on the battle here, so I'm just trying to keep up to where we are. At this point, it's still the 15th of November, right?
That's correct.
All right.
So we have Hal Moore has called the code word "Broken Arrow."
Right. Okay.
And that means an American unit is in great danger of being overrun, and all available air assets in South Vietnam must come to our aid. And we now have U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine aircraft stacked up from 7,000 to 35,000 feet, waiting their turn to deliver ordnance on this battlefield. And in the middle of that, a couple of F-100 Super Sabres mistake the information given on where to approach and where to drop. And here they come, and the lead plane has already punched the pickle switch on 2 cans of napalm, and they're lob-lollying end over end directly toward the command post where we are behind the termite hill. And Hal Moore is yelling at Charlie Hastings, the Air Force liaison, "Get that second son of a bitch off of us before he drops too." And he gets called off, but we got to eat those 2 cans that are coming in. And they go right over our heads and impact maybe 25, 30 feet into the clearing, right where a small party of engineers had just dug foxholes, and 2 of them are dancing in the fire.
So wait, you saw the napalm being dropped? You could visually see it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's coming straight at us.
What is that feeling like?
Well, it scares the shit out of you. And then there's this explosion of fire, and the heat wave hits the side of my face. And all I can think of, I can see these 2 boys dancing in the fire, screaming. And I got up, a medic named Tommy Burlisle out of Jacksonville, Florida. He got up, and we both ran toward the fire and the burning men. And he takes a sniper round and goes down KIA. And I get there and help pick up a young boy named Jim Nakayama out of Rigby, Idaho. And he is burned bad and screaming. And we carry him over to where the battalion surgeon is and the medics, and they start pumping him full of morphine. But that boy is not going to make it. He died 2 days later.
Still tough for you to talk about, huh?
It's tough. It's tough. That boy is my nightmare. Has been now for 54 years. That week, his wife gave birth to a daughter who would never, ever know her daddy. And I have met Trudy Nakayama and daughter Nikki several times. We talk about these things.
Never gets easier?
Never gets easier. I learned so much. I learned that there's no way in such a situation that you can be a neutral observer. It's too overwhelming. You can't just look and watch and take notes and shoot pictures. You got to help. You got to fight.
Joe,
you got to take that rifle off your shoulder and start killing people. Because if you don't, they're going to kill you, and they're going to kill the wounded, and we'll all go down.
Joe, did you ever stop and think about maybe you got in too deep with this, or maybe you shouldn't have, taken this correspondence job in Vietnam? Did any of that ever occur?
Never. I knew I was where I was supposed to be. I knew, look, not one of us left that place the same man he was when he got there. We all carried away memories of the horror. I left there knowing that 80 young American boys had laid down their lives so that I could live to tell their stories. I left there with an abiding love in my heart for soldiers and Marines, the grunts who fight all our wars. And it changed my life.
Outside of Jimmy, what else stays with you from the battle? Anything?
Oh, there are lots of snapshots of, laying on the ground and a thump next to me, and there's a pound and a half of red-hot shrapnel from a 500-pound bomb. 2 feet over, and I'd be a dead man. You see so much. I looked up and I saw a guy wearing a white T-shirt come staggering out into the clearing in the middle of the fight. And we're all waving at him, go back, get under cover. And finally he sees us and he turns to walk back, and that white T-shirt is covered in red. His back is shredded by shrapnel. He's just trying to get to the aid station. The snapshots are endless.
Do you feel like I know this question seems almost callous given everything you told us, but from a journalistic standpoint, did you accomplish everything you wanted to about covering that battle?
Of course not. I worked for UPI. The saying used to be that the second coming of Christ was only worth 1,200 words if you got pictures. And I knew that the limits on how much I could say and write were so much. I knew leaving there that this was worth a book. I knew leaving there that there were 2 of us who were going to write that book. It was me and Hal Moore.
Of course, that book ends up becoming We Were Soldiers, and, the movie gets made off of it, as you've detailed and we spoke about. So, let me ask you about your relationship with Colonel Hal Moore. Because as you mentioned, these guys leave Vietnam and you ended up staying, which is, after this, the fact that you stayed another 3 or 4 years is maniacal to me. Like, I can't process that. But that said, talk to me about the rest of your relationship with Hal Moore.
Well, we stood together at the end of the battle, and the tears rolled down our cheeks over all that we had seen. He's standing there feeling guilty that so many of his men had been killed and he had not died. And we both knew that one day we would have to tell this story. And I would say the kind of man Hal Moore is best told by somebody sent us to see a lawyer/literary agent named Bob Barnett in Washington, D.C. when we were, working on the book and we needed a publisher. And we go see this guy, and he's a terrific agent, a terrific lawyer. And we're sitting there talking about this, and he said, the first thing I need to see is a copy of the agreement between you two, me and Hal. And I look at Hal, and he looks at me, and Hal leans forward, and he tells this lawyer, look, this is just a little matter of some money. Joe and I have trusted each other with our lives in battle. We got nothing but a handshake, but that means everything. Hal Moore became my best friend, and I was his best friend as long as we were alive. And that was the real deal. And he snookered me into agreeing that whichever one of us died first, the other one had to preach his funeral. And so it fell to me in my older years to first preach the funeral of Sergeant Major Basil L. Plumley, and then 7 years later to preach the funeral of Lieutenant General Hal Moore.
Incredible stuff, Joe. 33 years after this battle at Ia Drang, you get awarded the Bronze Star for Valor. You're the only civilian to be awarded the Bronze Star with Valor from the United States Army. How does this whole thing come about?
Well, I didn't know that it was underway or that it was happening. Hal Moore sat down and wrote a recommendation following standard Army procedure and sent it in. And for 2 years, the Army, in its wisdom, had a committee of judge advocate general lawyers lawyering the hell out of it and deciding that they could do it, and then did it. They called me up one day and said, you have been awarded the Bronze Star with a V for Valor in combat. And I said, you've got the wrong guy. I'm a civilian. And they said, no, we got the right guy, and we know you were a civilian, but you get the medal. And we want you to come to Washington, D.C., and we'll present this medal to you in the office of the Chief of Army Information. And I said, no, you won't. I said, this medal is being given to me for actions in combat with the infantry, and you will either present it to me in front of soldiers, or you can just mail it to me. And they said, well, what do you suggest? I said, well, General Moore and I are going to be at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, doing a lecture, an officer professional development lecture to the 82nd Airborne. Why not do it there? And that's how it was done and where it was done. And I wear it, a lapel pin signifying that award on my coat every time I put it on, not only as an honor to me, but really as an honor to the 70-plus war correspondents, most of them photographers, who were killed in Vietnam in search of the truth. It's their medal, too.
Joe, that makes me smile. I don't exactly know why, but the whole thing makes me smile. Makes me proud. Like, you know, as somebody who is a soldier, that you cared that much about it being done in front of soldiers. I get that. I get why you wanted it done in front of soldiers. I think that's special.
Only place it should have been done.
Yeah. I mean, it seems right. Let me ask you, did you ever ask Hal why he decided to write the award after all that time?
I never did. We never really talked about it.
Interesting. And want to give any guesses as to why?
I can't really guess. I think he must have thought that I deserved it because he didn't take no wooden nickels.
I want to ask you one more thing about the Vietnam War, because you were a big part of the documentary, Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam. We've had several people on the podcast, who have been featured in that documentary. I guess, did you enjoy it? How comprehensive did you think it was? I'm a huge fan of it. Kind of give me some reaction to it.
Look, I was brought into that 7 or 8 years before it aired.
Right.
I sat for 11 hours of film interview in New York City. I was put on the payroll as a permanent consultant and went to meetings with Ken Burns and his production crew. And I'm proud of what came out of that. I think if you didn't know anything about the Vietnam War and you sat and you watched all 10 of those episodes, at the end of it, you'll know pretty much all you need to know about the Vietnam War, from our side, from the South Vietnamese side, from the enemy's side. There's something here after the war and after we wrote the book. The Vietnamese sent me a cable and said, okay, you've been trying to get back to the battlefield, and we're prepared now to let you do that. And we went back to Vietnam, Hal and myself and the sergeant major and a dozen veterans of the fight, and hooked up in Hanoi with General Wen Hu An, who was Hal's opposite number at the fight, and 3 of his colonels, all of whom had done their very best to kill us all. And we went back to that battlefield and walked that blood-soaked ground together. But more importantly, on the way, we spent the better part of a week bouncing along Highway 1 from Da Nang to Quy Nhon, up Route 19 to Pleiku, with those North Vietnamese and a couple of good translators. And afterward, Hal and I sat there and kind of dissected the experience. And what we figured out was that we had more in common with those guys who were our enemies than we do with your average American civilian.
The cathartic nature of doing that, of going back there, I know my generation of combat vets from Iraq and Afghanistan, I hope we all get the opportunity to do that. I hope somewhere down the road I get to walk through Baghdad and see the things and the trials and tribulations that we had to go through. It's an experience I long for. I really do. Because
I hope you get to do that, and I hope there's nobody trying to kill you while you do it.
Yeah.
I found the whole Iraq experience so totally different from Vietnam. The very idea for me to get from downtown Baghdad to Camp Victory to hook up with the Americans and go with the Army, they had to have 2 cars, a lead car and a follow car, put me in the back seat under a pile of bulletproof armor vests. And, we're stopping at red lights in the city and people are glaring at us. And it was just eerie. I was relieved to get to the base and hook up with an American convoy that was headed west, arguably in a much more dangerous situation. But I was just happy to have American troops around me.
Yeah. One other quick question. As far as the movie We Were Soldiers is concerned, I know you were part of the consulting for it, but did you like it? Did it hit the mark for you? Did it hit all the right notes?
Hal and I agreed that it was 75% reality based on our book and 25% Hollywood bullshit. And that's the reverse of normal for those guys. So
right, yeah.
We were kind of happy, but we were still pissed off that we couldn't get that extra 25% truth. Every time the director made a Hollywood decision, it was wrong. If he had just followed the story in the book, followed the truth, it would have been far more dramatic.
No, I agree. I mean, it's hard. Hollywood tends to bastardize a lot of things and takes our stories and makes them something to what they want, not what they actually are. But I think that you got 75-25 is probably more than most people would have gotten or most stories have gotten.
We worked 8 long years to get that. And it wasn't easy.
Well, Joe, listen, I mean, we didn't even get a chance to cover your entire journalism career because it expands so much more. But, you know, hearing you talk and still hearing the passion in your voice for everything that you went through, and you could still hear, even though Hal is gone, that he's still a part of your life every day. I thank you for all that you have done for the military and the way you've covered it.
I got one more thing for you. There's a new movie came out early this year called Shock and Awe, made by Rob Reiner. It's a pure journalism movie of the year 2002 when me and 3 of my colleagues at Knight Ridder newspapers were the only reporters in America challenging the lies that Bush and Cheney were telling to drag us into an unnecessary war in Iraq. And it's the older Galloway, and Reiner hired an actor named Tommy Lee Jones, a fellow Texan, to play me in that movie. I recommend it highly. I think you'll enjoy it.
Well, I will certainly check it out, and we'll make sure all of our listeners do the same. Again, Joe Galloway, just thank you so much for your candor, your honesty, your patriotism, and your desire for the truth through journalism. I think it's something that's rare nowadays, and the fact that you're still, singing for that cause, I think is absolutely amazing. But Joe Galloway, I can't thank you enough, and thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.